7:14 in the morning of June 19, 2026, Catherine, Princess of Wales, made a phone call that bypassed 3 layers of standard household coordination and reached King Charles's private secretary directly. The call lasted 90 seconds. She did not request an audience. She did not ask for a convenient time. She said, with the specific flatness of a person who has already made the decision and is communicating it rather than proposing it, that she needed to see the king before noon, that the matter concerned the security status of 4 children who shared the same grandfather, and that she would be arriving at Windsor Castle at 10 o'clock regardless of what appeared on the sovereign's calendar. The private secretary, who had served 3 monarchs across 22 years and who had fielded every conceivable variation of urgent royal communication, would later describe the call as the only one in his career where the requester's tone made it clear that the meeting was not being requested. It was being announced. By the end of this video, you will understand what triggered that call at 7:14 in the morning, what Catherine said when she sat across from her father-in-law in the private audience room at Windsor Castle, and how the framework she proposed in that 90-minute meeting fundamentally altered the institutional position of Prince Harry's children in a way that Harry himself did not anticipate, not request, and initially did not want.
This was not William's intervention. This was not a procedural correction or a governance review.
This was a mother who had identified a threat to children, including children who were not her own, and who understood that the only authority sufficient to address it sat in a specific room in a specific castle and had to be engaged before the end of the day. Before we trace what happened inside that room, make sure you are subscribed. There are elements of this meeting that no palace briefing has acknowledged, and dimensions that only become visible when you understand what Catherine knew before she made that phone call. The trigger was not a headline. It was not a public statement from Harry or Meghan. It was not a media leak or a tabloid revelation. It was a single paragraph buried on page 14 of a routine security assessment report generated by the Royal Protection Command's annual review cycle, a report that was distributed to 7 household offices on June 17th, and that most recipients filed without detailed examination, because annual security reviews are administrative documents, not operational alerts. But Catherine read the full report. She read every page. She had done so every year since 2023, when she first requested access to the complete protection assessments covering all minor members of the royal family, not just her own children. That request had been unusual at the time. The private secretary's office had processed it with visible surprise, because the standard protocol limited each household's review to its own dependents. Catherine had argued, quietly but firmly, that as the mother of the children who would one day occupy the centre of the institution, she needed to understand the full protective architecture surrounding every child who existed within the extended family structure, because threats to any child in the perimeter created vulnerabilities for all of them. The request had been granted, and every year since she had read every page. On page 14 of the 2026 assessment, in a paragraph formatted identically to dozens of other routine observations, the reviewing officer noted a classification change regarding the protection status of children belonging to non-working royals residing outside the United Kingdom. The language was technical. It referenced a 2024 policy adjustment that had reclassified certain categories of overseas-dependent minors from active protective coverage to advisory-only status, meaning that the Royal Protection Command would no longer maintain operational awareness of their movements, communications, or residential security arrangements, but would instead provide periodic written guidance to their parents on personal security matters. The reclassification had been implemented as part of the broader resource consolidation that accompanied the monarchy's structural reduction under King Charles. It was logical. It was fiscally responsible. It was, in administrative terms, entirely defensible. And it meant that Archie and Lilibet Wales, aged 7 and 5, residing in California, had been moved without public announcement or parental notification from a category in which the British state maintained active protective awareness to a category in which they received the same institutional attention as any private citizen's children. No one had told Harry. No one had told Meghan. The change had occurred through administrative drift, processed through policy channels that did not require individual notification for subjects who had voluntarily departed the working royal structure. Catherine read that paragraph at 6:40 in the morning on June 19th. She read it again. She set the report down. She sat in the kitchen of Adelaide Cottage while the house was still quiet and the children were still asleep upstairs. And she thought about what that paragraph meant in practical terms. It meant that if a credible threat emerged against those 2 children, the British security apparatus would not know. It meant that if a security incident occurred at their residence, The institutional response framework that would automatically activate for her own children would not activate for them. It meant that two children who shared the same grandfather as George, Charlotte, and Louis, who carried the same bloodline, who existed within the same public profile, whether they wished to or not, had been quietly moved into a category where their safety was no longer the institution's active concern. She thought about this for 34 minutes, and then she picked up the phone. But here is the question that most observers will ask, and that requires a direct answer before we proceed further. Why Catherine? Why not William? Why not the private secretary's office? Why not a formal written submission through standard channels? The answer is specific, and it reveals something about Catherine's understanding of institutional authority that differs fundamentally from how William operates. William's authority within the institution derives from succession. He is the heir. His interventions carry the weight of future sovereignty. But that authority is prospective. It is powerful, but it is not yet absolute. Catherine's authority is different. It derives from a position that no governance document explicitly defines, but that every member of the institution instinctively recognizes. She is the mother of the next generation's center. She is the woman whose children will inherit everything. And that position grants her a specific kind of institutional standing that is not procedural, but protective. It is the authority of the person who will be held responsible by history and by public judgment if something happens to a child within the family perimeter. She understood that this authority, exercised at the right moment, could accomplish something that procedural channels could not. It could make the king act not as an administrator processing a policy review, but as a grandfather confronting a specific vulnerability affecting his grandchildren. She was not invoking governance. She was invoking blood. The meeting took place at 10:07 in the private audience room on the first floor of Windsor Castle's East Wing. This was not the formal audience room used for state business. It was the smaller room, the one with the worn carpet and the windows overlooking the Long Walk, where the sovereign receives family rather than dignitaries. Catherine chose this room in her phone request. The choice was deliberate. It signaled that what she was bringing was not an institutional matter requiring institutional formality. It was a family matter requiring family attention. Charles was seated when she entered. He had cancelled his 10:30 engagement with the Commonwealth Secretary-General. He had not done this lightly. The private secretary's note to the Secretary-General's office cited a scheduling conflict of a personal nature. The language was precise, personal, not institutional, not procedural, personal. Catherine did not sit immediately. She placed a single folder on the table between them. Not a dossier, not a bound document, a folder, thin, cream-coloured, containing 4 sheets of paper. She sat. She did not open with preamble. She did not frame the conversation in institutional language. She said, according to the account that exists in the private secretary's meeting record, the following words. Your Majesty, I need to speak to you about 4 children. 2 of them are mine. 2 of them are Harry's. And as of this week, the institution responsible for their safety has decided that 2 of them no longer require active protection. I am here because I cannot accept that framework, and I believe you cannot accept it either, because if something happens to either of those children, and we learn afterward that we knew the vulnerability existed and chose administrative convenience over operational awareness, no amount of institutional justification will survive the public reckoning, and more importantly, no amount of personal peace will survive the private one. Charles did not respond immediately. The private secretary's record notes a pause of approximately 45 seconds. Then he asked a single question. What are you proposing? Catherine opened the folder. The 4 sheets contained what she had written between 7:14 and 9:30 that morning during the drive from Adelaide Cottage to Windsor. It was not a policy document. It was not a governance proposal. It was a framework. 4 pages, handwritten in parts, typed in others, clearly composed under time pressure, but structured with the precision of someone who had been thinking about this architecture for longer than the 34 minutes she had sat in her kitchen that morning. The framework proposed a new classification category within the Royal Protection Command's operational structure. Not working royal, not departed royal, not private citizen. A 4th category, minor dependents of the bloodline. A category that would carry active protective awareness regardless of the parent's institutional status, regardless of geographic residence, regardless of whether the children's parents had voluntarily departed the working structure. The category would be permanent. It would apply to all children born into the direct bloodline until they reached the age of 18. It would not require parental consent to activate. It would not be subject to annual resource. It would be classified as a standing obligation of the institution, independent of policy adjustment cycles. Charles read all 4 pages. He read them twice. The private secretary's record notes that he removed his reading glasses after the second reading, placed them on the table, and said something that was not recorded in formal language, but that the private secretary transcribed as closely as memory permitted. He said, "You are telling me that my son's children in California are no longer being watched." And she said, "I am telling you that as of this assessment cycle, they are not." And he said, "And you came here this morning because you decided that was unacceptable." And she said, "I came here this morning because I am the person who will be standing next to the future king when the question is asked what we knew and what we did about it. And I will not be standing there with an answer that says it was handled through administrative review. I will be standing there with an answer that says we protected every child in this family, regardless of where their parents chose to live or what titles they chose to carry. And I need your signature on that framework today because the next assessment cycle begins in September, and I will not allow those children to enter another year in a category that treats them as advisory." The conversation continued for another 40 minutes. The details of those 40 minutes are not fully recorded in the private secretary's notes because they moved into territory that both participants understood as personal rather than institutional. But the structural outcome is documented. Charles agreed to the framework in principle. He agreed to sign the authorization before the end of the day. He agreed to bypass the standard policy review cycle that would have subjected the new category to 18 months of administrative consultation. He agreed because Catherine had presented him with something he could not refuse, without compromising his own understanding of what the monarchy owed to the children born within it. She had not argued from governance, she had argued from obligation. Not institutional obligation, blood obligation. The obligation that exists prior to titles, prior to working status, prior to any administrative framework, the obligation that says a child born into this family is this family's responsibility, regardless of what their parents decide about their own relationship to the institution. But here is where the story becomes genuinely complex, because the framework Catherine proposed did not simply restore protective coverage to Archie and Milibet. It created a structural mechanism that required ongoing operational contact between the Royal Protection Command and the children's household, regardless of the parents' preferences. Active protective awareness is not passive monitoring. It requires communication channels. It requires periodic security assessments of residential arrangements. It requires coordination with local law enforcement in the jurisdiction where the children reside. It requires, in practical terms, a functional communication relationship between the British security apparatus and the parents. For Harry and Meghan, who had departed the working structure in part to escape institutional oversight of their daily lives, this requirement represented something they had not anticipated. Not restriction, not surveillance, but contact. Structured, ongoing, institutionally mandated contact regarding their children's security that could not be declined without formally opting out of the protective framework, an action that would itself generate documentation and public visibility far greater than the contact itself required.
Harry was notified on the evening of June 19th.
Not by Catherine, not by Charles, by the private secretary's office, through a formal communication that outlined the new classification, described the operational requirements it entailed, and provided a 14-day window for the parents to raise any objections through proper channels. The communication was respectful. It was not accusatory. It did not reference the previous classification or explain why the change had occurred. It simply stated the new framework, the requirements it created, and the timeline for implementation. Harry's response, delivered through his legal representatives within 48 hours, was not refusal. It was not acceptance. It was a request for clarification on 3 specific operational points: the frequency of contact, the identity of the liaison officers involved, and the scope of information that would be shared with local authorities in California. The questions were practical. They were the questions of a father trying to understand what the framework would look like in daily life. They were not the questions of a man rejecting institutional authority. And that distinction matters because it reveals that Catherine's framework accomplished something that no previous institutional approach to Harry had managed. It created a structure he could engage with without feeling controlled because the structure was not about him. It was about his children. And for his children, he would engage. This brings us to the element of the story that has generated the most sustained private discussion within palace circles and that no public briefing has addressed. Catherine did not consult William before making the phone call. She did not consult him before driving to Windsor. She did not consult him before presenting the framework to the king. This is not a detail to move past quickly. In the operational culture of the Prince of Wales's household, major institutional interventions are coordinated. They are discussed. They are assessed for strategic implications before execution. Catherine bypassed all of that. She acted alone, on her own authority, in a domain that she had identified as hers rather than his. And when William learned of the meeting, his response, according to those within the household, was not irritation. It was not surprise. It was a single sentence spoken to his private secretary. Good, that needed to happen today. He understood what she had done. He understood why she had done it without consultation. And he understood that the authority she had invoked was not his authority and could not have been his authority. It was the authority of a mother speaking about children, and that authority operated in a register that succession-based power could not access without appearing calculated rather than protective. But there is a deeper layer to Catherine's decision to act alone, and it connects to something she understood about the institutional dynamics surrounding Harry that William's position prevented him from seeing clearly. William's relationship with Harry was, by June 2026, structurally defined by the governance disputes of the preceding years, the Article 4 invocation, the boundary clarifications, the procedural corrections. Every institutional interaction between the brothers was now processed through the lens of governance, which meant that any action William took regarding Harry's children would be read as an extension of the brothers' institutional conflict, rather than as a protective measure. Catherine's intervention escaped that lens. She was not Harry's brother. She was not his institutional counterpart. She was his sister-in-law. More importantly, she was the mother of his nieces and nephews' cousins. Her authority to speak about children's safety was not derived from governance position. It was derived from the same source as Harry's own parental authority. She was a mother, identifying a vulnerability affecting children. And that framing made her intervention legible to Harry in a way that William's could never be, because it came from the same emotional register he occupied himself. Charles understood this too. It was why he agreed to the not because Catherine's institutional argument was unassailable, though it was, not because the security assessment demanded immediate action, though it did, but because Catherine had presented him with a framing that allowed him to act as a grandfather rather than as a sovereign processing a policy change. She had given him permission to respond emotionally to a situation that institutional channels would have required him to process administratively, and in doing so, she had accomplished something that no policy document, no governance review, and no procedural intervention could have accomplished. She had made the king feel personally responsible for a specific set of children in a way that bypassed the administrative distance that his role normally imposed. That personal responsibility, once activated, generated a signature, and that signature, once placed, created a framework that no future administrator could dismantle without contradicting the sovereign's expressed personal commitment. The framework was signed on the evening of June 19th. It entered operational effect on July 1st, 2026. The new classification, minor dependence of the bloodline, was added to the Royal Protection Command's operational manual as a standing category exempt from annual resource review. Archie and Lilibet Wales were reclassified from advisory-only status to active protective awareness. Communication channels were established between the Protection Command's Overseas Liaison Office and the Children's Household in California. The first operational contact was made on July 8th. It was described by those involved as brief, respectful, and focused exclusively on practical security matters. No institutional commentary. No family discussion. No reference to titles, status, or governance. Simply the operational requirements of ensuring that two children, aged 7 and 5, living 4,000 miles from the institution that claimed responsibility for their safety, were being actively watched over by people who had the resources and the mandate to act if watching revealed a threat. For Harry, the change was more significant than the operational framework suggests. The reclassification meant that his children were formally acknowledged within the institution's protective architecture in a way that his own departure had not anticipated. He had left the working structure. He had surrendered his security detail.
He had chosen independence.
But his children had not chosen anything. They were 7 and 5. They existed within a public profile they had not selected, carrying a family name that generated attention they could not control, living in a country where the specific threat environment surrounding British royal children was not fully understood by local authorities. Catherine's framework acknowledged this reality. It said without sentimentality and without institutional judgment that these children belong to this family regardless of their parents' choices, and that belonging carries protective obligations that the institution will not abandon because of administrative convenience or policy consolidation. For Harry, Receiving that acknowledgement from the institution he had departed carried a weight that no previous communication from the palace had carried. It was not an invitation back. It was not a reconciliation gesture. It was something more fundamental. It was the institution saying that his children mattered to it independently of his relationship to it, and that mattered to him in ways that he has not publicly articulated, but that those close to him describe as significant. But the story does not end with the framework's implementation, because Catherine's intervention created a precedent that extends beyond Harry's children. The minor dependence of the bloodline classification applies to all children born into the direct bloodline until age 18. It is not specific to one household or one set of parents. It is structural. It is permanent. And it means that any future child born to any member of the extended royal family, regardless of their working status, regardless of their geographic residence, regardless of their parents' relationship to the institution, will carry active protective awareness as a standing entitlement that cannot be removed through administrative review. Catherine did not build a framework for Archie and Lilibet. She built a framework for every child who will ever be born into this family. And she built it in a single morning, in a small room at Windsor Castle, by refusing to accept that administrative convenience was an adequate answer to the question of what the institution owes to its youngest members. This brings us to the final question that the meeting raises, and it is the question that will shape the institution's internal culture for years to come. How did Catherine know to read page 14? How did she know that the annual security assessment would contain a classification change buried in routine language? How did she know that the change would affect Harry's children specifically? The answer is not dramatic. It is not the product of insider information or confidential briefing. It is the product of a practice she established in 2023 and maintained without interruption for 3 years. She read every page, every year. Not because she expected to find something, because she understood that the things that matter most in institutional life are not announced. They are buried. They are placed in routine documents formatted in administrative language designed to be filed without examination. They are processed through channels that assume no one will read closely enough to notice. Catherine noticed because Catherine read. And she read because she understood that the safety of children was not a matter that could be delegated to administrative cycles and policy review boards. It required a specific person, reading a specific document at a specific time, who would recognize what she was seeing and act on it before the next cycle buried it deeper. The meeting is now part of the institutional record. The framework is operational. The children are protected. The communication channels function. The annual assessment cycle will never again reclassify a bloodline child into advisory status without triggering the standing exemption Catherine's signature created. And somewhere in the private archive at Windsor Castle, in a file that bears no dramatic classification and carries no special restriction, the 4-page framework sits alongside the King's signature and the date. 19th, 2026. The morning a mother drove to a castle and told a grandfather that his grandchildren needed watching. And the grandfather signed. Because some obligations exist prior to institutions. Some responsibilities exist prior to titles. And some authorities are not derived from succession or governance or procedural position, but from the simple, unassailable fact that you are the person who will be asked, when it matters most, what you did when you knew. Catherine knew. She acted. And 4 children, 2 of whom she has never met, are safer because of what she did at 7:14 on a June morning when the house was quiet and the children were still asleep upstairs. If you have watched this far, you now understand not just what happened at Windsor Castle on June 19th, but why it could only have been Catherine who did it, why it could only have happened in the form it took, and why the framework it produced will outlast every other institutional intervention of this period. You understand that the emergency was not dramatic. It was administrative. It was a paragraph on page 14. And you understand that the response was not procedural. It was personal. It was a mother refusing to accept that children could be downgraded through policy language. They are not telling you about this meeting because the meeting does not fit the narrative they prefer. It does not fit the story of institutional conflict between brothers. It does not fit the story of governance disputes and procedural corrections. It fits a different story. The story of a woman who read every page, who noticed what others filed away, and who drove to a castle on a Thursday morning to tell a king that his grandchildren mattered. That is the story. And it changed everything. Not because it was dramatic, because it was true. Subscribe, because the next chapter examines how the minor dependence framework is already reshaping the institution's approach to the next generation's security in ways that will define the monarchy's operational structure for the next 30 years.
The meeting is over. The signature is dry.
But the architecture Catherine built in 4 pages on a June morning is only beginning to carry weight. And somewhere in California, 2 children are sleeping in a house that is now being watched by people who answer to a framework that their aunt wrote by hand in a kitchen while the rest of the house was still quiet. That is the legacy. Not a title, not a ceremony. A framework, 4 pages, a signature, and the knowledge that someone read page 14.